Hi, everybody. Stephanie Wolfe here with Darla Henry and Associates. And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time with you today talking about how we can stay connected in a physically distant environment. Many of us are finding ourselves in a situation where we're not getting to spend as much time as we would like with our youth and with the families that we work with. But there are definitely ways that we can stay connected. And it's important to think about how we do that in this environment. So I hope you enjoy the presentation and let's get started. We're going to just talk a little bit as an introduction to the impact of physical distance on relationships and just look at that for a bit. And then we're going to take the rest of the presentation to walk you through the 7 skills of the 357 model as they would play out in a virtual world. I'll just talk a little bit about technical issues. I'm not necessarily a technology expert when it comes to that, but just a couple of tricks that I've heard from others along the way that might be helpful. And then I want to share some ideas with you about some of the different activities that you might be able to do in this virtual platform. And then we're going to talk about self-care because that's really, really important for all of us in doing this work. First, let's just kind of talk a little bit about impact of physical distance on relationships. And you might kind of think about the impact of physical distance on your own relationships over the last several weeks and think about what you might be noticing, right? You might be feeling a little bit disconnected with some of your friends and families. You might be feeling a little more connected because maybe you've been reaching out more during this time than you have in the past. What's kind of interesting about this is that the idea of social distancing or physical distancing flies really in the face of what we know about relationships and what feels natural to us, because as humans, we're kind of wired to be connecting with people and to be present with people. And so this is really difficult and kind of hard for us to figure out. A lot of our sense of safety comes from feeling like we're in sync with other people. And when you're not physically present with them, it can be a little bit harder to feel that synchronicity with them. So this is a challenge for us. We know we talk a lot about the attachment cycle in our work. It's a cornerstone of what we do. And so this is a good reminder, right, to think about how relationships are built and how they're strengthened. And so often we think about the attachment cycle most often when we think about infants and how infants develop a bond or attachment with their caregiver. And essentially, you know what that is. The baby expresses a need. There's some sort of behavioral response to the need. So I come and feed the baby, or I pick the baby up and I rock the baby, or I do whatever I need to do to satisfy the need. And then that changes the behavior and the need is met. And we repeat that cycle over and over and over again. And what we say is, the attachment cycle describes every relationship that you have had, every relationship you have now, and every relationship that you will have in the future is defined in some way by this attachment cycle. What is the level of need that people in your life are meeting? And so the strength of their meeting of those needs, whatever those needs might be, and there are many, that really dictates or helps us understand the strength of the relationship. And sometimes relationships continue for long periods of time, and sometimes relationships are for short periods, all going back to this idea of how a need has been met or not met in some cases. So the attachment cycle is something for us to think about, right? How are we able to identify and meet the needs of the people that we care about? This is a little bit harder when we're not physically present with them, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go along. Separation makes this really difficult because when we are separated from people, it can be a little bit harder to understand what those needs are. It can be harder for us to express to other people what our needs are. We often don't express in words what our needs are. We do that in terms of our proximity to another person, or in these little sort of hints that we give to each other in our nonverbal communication. And it can be much harder and sometimes even impossible to pick up on some of those cues. And so we've really got to make sure that we're paying attention to that. The other thing that kind of is a overlay around our current situation and separation is the idea that separation is often connected to traumatizing experiences. So when you're having a traumatizing experience, you often feel very separated, from the rest of the world, or separated from safety. And so this can be really important and helps us understand why, for some of us who've had really traumatic experiences in our past, separation can be even more difficult to manage. Often too, we can think about how our youth test us in relationships. Our youth often have not had good experiences with relationships. And so they kind of come up with, not necessarily consciously, but they come up with ways of testing, our level of loyalty to them, or our level of caring about them. I heard a colleague recently talk about this in his own experience, kind of sharing that he found himself sort of waiting to see who was going to reach out to him during this period of social distancing, rather than having the mindset of, I'm going to reach out to people that I care about. And you might find some of your youth and families are doing that as well, that they're going to wait for you to respond or you to reach out. They're not necessarily going to be proactive about that. And so it's really on us as a professionals to make sure we're doing that reach out and that we're trying to connect with our youth and families. We think about this as the positive interaction cycle. This has been a concept that we've taught as part of the 3-5-7 model for many, many years, since the beginning. And this comes out of the work of Vera Fahlberg, which says that when we're interacting, when we're trying to initiate interaction, it's the parent, it's the adult, it's the caregiver, right, who needs to always be introducing or offering an interaction to a young person. At some point, the youth is going to respond positively to that. There might be lots of instances before you get that positive response where you get a rejecting behavior. But the idea here is that we keep trying. No matter what the response is, no matter what the relationship test is, we're going to keep reaching out to our youth and families until they are starting to respond positively, that we don't give up on that. And we want to continue that cycle and that pattern as much as possible. It's really, really important. So especially during this time where we're definitely physically separated from each other, this positive interaction cycle is really something to be paying attention to. So those are just a couple of kind of background ideas that we thought were most important to bring to your attention as you're thinking about how to approach your work in this virtual environment. So let's start talking about the 7 skills, and what do the 7 skills of the 3-5-7 model look like in this new way of working. And we talk a lot, obviously, about establishing a perception of safety and how important that is, that our youth and families feel safe when they're working with us, that they're in a really vulnerable place and they need to feel safe and comfortable. And so you are probably going to have a lot of different types of contacts with your youth and families during this period where you're out of your normal routine of your home visit or your in-person contact. And not every contact is going to take the form of a sort of traditional session where you're doing an activity. You may be doing something a little more informal, like just checking in to say hi or making sure they're doing okay. And when I say informal, I don't want anyone to make the mistake that I mean that that's less important, because sometimes those informal or really quick check-ins actually can go a long, long way, maybe even more impactful than doing your session or doing an activity. But we want to think about some things like, trying to have an engaging space as much as possible. And I know this is difficult because we're all sort of stacked up with each other. Our families are home, our kids are sort of running around doing things. You might have a spouse or roommate or other people who aren't really involved in our work, but they're present. And so this might be a little challenging for some of us in terms of thinking about our space. But it's important that you try to think about, is my space engaging as much as possible? Am I working in a space that's as private as possible? Because we do need to think about those concerns. You might think about having a do not disturb sign on your door if you're sort of in an office space that you have at home, or if you're in a separate location that has a door, that's probably best so that you can have as much privacy as possible. And you also want to be thinking about the limitations of your client space. What about your youth and families? Who's around them? Do you need to be sensitive about what you talk about and how you talk about it, because we don't know who else might be in the room hearing what we're saying. So it's a different thing for us to think about when we're not in the room, and you can't, right now you can't see beyond what's in the camera view. And so we've got to be really kind of aware of that. The idea too is that you may have some consistency in your space. So if I'm connecting with my young person and they consistently see this same thing behind me, it's that brick wall and this blue space behind, there's something that can be comforting about that. There's something that can be reassuring about kind of a consistency in choosing the space. What we don't want necessarily is we don't want to have distractions of every time we interact in this way with our youth, that they're trying to figure out where we are and they're kind of more curious about the background than anything else. So if you can do something to make sure that you have some consistency in your space, that can be helpful. I want to talk about this idea of being on time, and the importance of, being able to sort of count on something, or that when we say we're going to do something, we do it. And our clients might not always be reacting or responding in that way. So many of you could, thinking about, well, I have a 2 o'clock appointment with my client, and sometimes they don't show up till 2:15 or 2:30. So they're not necessarily concerned about time. Well, we want to be concerned about time as much as we can, right? Because what that shows is that we're honoring the time, that this time is important to us, that our youth is important to us. And so being on time is part of that. It's part of setting structure. One of the things that we've been all struggling with, I think, in many ways, is the idea that our routines are so out of whack. And so being on time is part of what helps to create a little bit of that structure, and helping people to know what to expect. It's just something to think about. Continuity is something else that we talk about in terms of creating safety as we do the work, as our first skill has told us here. And we got to make sure that we keep continuity, again, particularly right now. And so you might find that you're actually getting a little bit better continuity with your youth during this period of time. They're probably involved in less activities, right? If they're following social distancing guidelines, then they're not necessarily involved in as many things as they might have been otherwise. And so it might be a little bit easier to keep that continuity. You might have a little bit more time since you're not traveling, right? You're not traveling. Some of us, I know, when we're working with our families or our kids, we might be in the car for 45 minutes, an hour, maybe more at a time, just getting to and then returning from visits with our youth. So we're getting a little bit more time that might be available to us. And if we can use that to have really regular contact with our youth, that can be very, very helpful. Remember, we're kind of trained to think that this idea of a 50-minute session, that we're, if you don't spend an hour with your client, then that wasn't, productive time. And that's just not true. As I was mentioning a minute ago, and I've heard this from many, many experts, along with us doing this work, that reiterate this point, right? That you can have a really good therapeutic interaction with somebody in a matter of minutes, sometimes even a matter of seconds, right? A text message saying, hey, I'm thinking about you, hope you're okay. Just a quick follow-up about something that communicates to your young person that you're thinking about them, that, just because they're out of sight doesn't mean they're out of mind. And there's something really important to be said about that. Those few second interactions can be invaluable to the work that we're doing. Text messages, right? Just mentioned that this can really be important, and particularly for youth, they're used to communicating in this way. For some of us, we're sort of later to that bandwagon, so to speak, in terms of really using technology and even something as simple as a text message in this way. So, it's become very familiar to our youth. It's become part of how they communicate. And you might do something kind of fun with text messages. Maybe you're not going to communicate about really sensitive topics through a text message. You want to think about, whether it makes sense to do that or not. But even just doing something fun with your kids and families, right? So Monday is Manic Monday, and I'm going to send you an organizational tip. Or if you're working with, young people who are parenting, right, and you might send them kind of Tuesday's parenting tip, or Throwback Thursday, something interesting about the year they were born. So just doing something, again, anything that really is just connective, and lets that other person know that you're thinking about them, even though you don't get to spend the time that you maybe want to spend with them. Don't want to underestimate phone calls. I mean, sometimes it's just hearing somebody's voice can be reassuring, hearing a familiar voice. It doesn't have to be, again, a very long, drawn out phone call. This can be something that's relatively short, but sometimes picking up the phone, right, it is just something that we've maybe forgotten to do in some respects. And so, yeah, use that technology, send a text message, but pick up the phone, right? Pick up the phone and spend a few minutes talking with your young person. Here's the other thing, use the mail, good old fashioned snail mail, right? Who doesn't like getting kind of an interesting, nice little card in the mail? Most of the stuff that I get anymore is bills or junk mail, right? So, let's send a little card, right? Have a little note card, just something, hey, Steph, I was thinking about you. Hope everything's going well. Can't wait to see you again, right? Something really simple. You drop that in the mail. It's a nice little hello. Let somebody know that you're thinking about them, right? So these are just some really kind of quick, easy ways to think about doing your work a little differently in terms of how you engage and how you create safety in your space. All right, so next we're going to talk about how you provide opportunities to explore. And we always emphasize activities in our work because they are really good ways, in hands-on ways and tangible ways, to explore events of somebody's life and have them thinking about the relationships that they've had. And so it's like, how do we do this, right? How do we set the stage for providing opportunities to explore when we can't be in the room together and we can't manipulate things together? Well, first thing that I think about here is do not wing it. It's like I used to say all the time, the older version of this Steph Wolfe version of social work, I thought I could just show up. And it's really important that we don't just wing it, right? That we spend some time thinking about our preparation. So, what is it that might be going on for this young person right now? I mean, this is about tuning into their needs. And so you want to plan as you normally would with your approach to preparation of visits, just like you would if you were seeing them in person, right? So is there something that we can do together today that might help them address something that they've been wrestling with? And what might that be? And so, we use our readiness continuum when we're using the 3-5-7 model as a way to plan this approach. So we think about what's the clarification, integration, and actualization work that's happening right now, and how do I select an activity or plan a conversation or connect back to something that young person has said to me to help further their journey in that way. So, the bottom line here is put some thought into it. Let's not just try to wing it. Although, again, a lot of what we're doing these days feels somewhat like winging it. We're kind of learning as we go. So give yourself some grace with this, but definitely try to be planful in what you're doing. Look for really easily accessible materials. I used to sort of joke around about stealing things from my kids when they were little, and they would have a lot more things like Play-Doh or building blocks, things that I could use in sessions. I could just walk around my house and find lots of things that I could use during the session. So think about that. You might be able to, if you're not really savvy with technology and you don't necessarily know how to manipulate things, sharing of screen, that sort of thing on your technology, or that feels really cumbersome, you might just have a piece of flip chart paper behind you and draw a pros and cons list, or just have your youth pull out a piece of paper, right? So think about things that you have readily available that you can share and show. Think about things that your young person or your families might have available. Most people have something to write with or a piece of paper, right? That's not usually all that hard to find in most people's homes. And think about planning your activities in that way, right? Simple materials. These are usually things that are going to work best. Things that your family is likely to have on hand, that your young person will have there with them. Being present is another one of our 7 skills. We talk a lot about the idea of actually having our focus and attention on the young person when we're in the session, right? Who would have thought how important that is? And this visual connection is a really important part of that. So yes, text message is helpful. Picking up the phone can be helpful, but we need some of that visual connection, right? Many of us who are doing our work in these last several weeks, month or so now, more at this point, we are getting more on Zoom meetings. We're getting more of a visual connection than maybe we had in the past. And I think that's interesting. It sort of shows that we've been missing that for each other. So that visual connection is really important. Seeing the other person can really help you pick up on some of those nonverbal cues. Still going to be different than not having that in-person connection, but better than not having, sight, right? A visual of that person. So as much as you can turn that camera on. I know we want to say things sometimes like, oh, I'm not camera ready today, I don't want to turn the camera on. But don't be afraid of that. It's really important that we get some of this visual connectivity. We can actually see each other. Try to really avoid those distractions, right? I mean, we can really tell when you're on the call with us and you're checking your phone, or you're kind of, I'm going to sneak and check my email. We can see that's happening. And so, we want to conduct ourselves like we would if we were in an in-person visit. So our advice to you when we train on the 3-5-7 model is, you go in, we don't have the phone on. We're not distracted by other things that are happening. We're not checking our watch constantly. As much as possible, we want to try to avoid those distractions. Now, I get it. And this is much more challenging when, again, all of our kids are home, our roommates, our spouse, significant other, whatever that is, there are more people in your physical environment, which makes it a little more tricky to avoid those distractions. But as much as we possibly can, we want to try to minimize those things, right? And part of this too is having a professional experience or presence. appearance. So the idea of that is, we laugh and I think about, okay, so it's kind of funny to think about today we're going to do the meeting in our pajamas, right? But when we're working with our client, there is something that does convey importance to them when we have a professional looking appearance with them. And so that's an important thing to think about. Sort of the joke is, do you have pants on? Ha ha ha, right? But we want to make sure that, that we are conveying the importance of this time with our client. And sometimes our appearance is part of doing that. Attunement is another part of being present that we talk about a lot, and essentially, being really sensitive to the circumstances that our kids and families are in, and that's really important now more than ever, right? So you want to pay attention to cues about their level of regulation, right? So do you see them shifting around a lot? Are they missing calls with you? So have you set up time with them and they continually miss those appointments and they're not tuning in with that? This is honestly hard, right? Again, it's really hard when you're not in person to pick up on all those cues. So give yourself some grace there. We're all gonna miss some of this. We're not gonna get this right 100% of the time, but we wanna work really hard, as hard as we possibly can, to really get a good level of attunement and clue in, right, to what the current experience is with our young people. So we're all sort of experiencing physical distancing in a different way. And so we want to make sure that we're trying to really pay attention and hone in to what the experience of our young people are and really respond to that in the present. Of course, listening to the stories is another one of our 7 skills. So important. We talk about, the storytelling. That's the name of the game, folks, right? It's the idea of getting our young people to talk about their stories, getting them to think about how they make sense of those stories, the meaning that they give to things. And so we want to be able to show interest, right? That's part of having that visual connection, being able to show that we're paying attention and that we're here in the interaction with them. And so there's 2 things I talk about here with this is, I want you to be animated, right? So I want you to show those facial expressions. And I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago where I heard somebody say, you kind of have to amp it up. Like if you think your animation level is a 10, it's probably coming across as a 7. So if you wanted a 10, you probably need to be a 13, right? So we need to really kind of amp it up when it comes to our facial expressions and showing our interest. Don't sort of do it in that kind of awkward, fake way, but right, you got to sort of pay attention a little bit more to this, how we show our interest. But so we want to be animated, but we also want to be somewhat still, right? It's kind of distracting and doesn't really show our interest as well. It doesn't come across very well when we've got the computer moving around and shifting, or when we're moving around and doing a lot of shifting. So if I'm doing my session and I'm on my phone, with the camera, and my client is on theirs, and she's moving around a lot and I'm moving around a lot, it's just sort of hard to sort of maintain that level of interest. And the other person that is on with you, if you're moving around a lot, like that's, for me, I experience that as sort of dizzying and very distracting. So we want to be careful about that. Just be mindful about that as much as possible. The other part of this is kind of knowing how your camera works, right? In terms of where you need to look in the camera to actually make eye contact, right? To actually sort of connect. And this is a little challenging in terms of learning our platforms, because, when I look at you on the screen, I'm looking at you, but that's probably not the same as when I look into the camera and now I'm actually sort of, it feels like to the other person that I'm looking at them. So there's something kind of, awkward about that at times when we're doing this interaction using all of these platforms. But you want to think about this. What's the best place for me to be looking? How's my camera view working so that I can try to convey as much interest as possible, right? And that storytelling piece is really important. We're trying to really tune into those things. Affirming current perceptions. This is another one of our 7 skills we talk a lot about, and really important that we're doing this. And we talk a lot about this in terms of the framework of accepting and validating. Just be where your young person is. Just be where they are. So for some, if you're working with adolescents, they might be really experiencing a lot of frustration around physical distancing, right? That they can't be with their friends, they can't do what they want to do when they want to do it. And it's really, really challenging for adolescents who are at that stage where their job is to separate from caregivers and they're sort of stuck at home with their caregivers, right? So it's really this kind of strange thing to navigate. they may not understand the purpose of physical distancing, right? So it's, adolescents may have that mindset of, I'm not sick, my friends aren't sick, nobody that I know is sick, so what's the point of all of this, right? And this is probably not the time to go in necessarily to a lecture about why. Let me explain to you why physical distancing is so important. Probably not what we're looking for in that moment. More what we're looking for in that moment is to connect with the feeling behind that. Yeah, this is really hard, that you don't get to do what you want to do, right? You don't get to see your friends. You don't get to spend the time with them that you thought you were going to be spending, or you don't get to go to work. Maybe you were really excited about that job that you just got and now that's on hold, right? So we want to connect with those things. Listen, the idea that our youth are missing or want to spend time with their friends and they can't do that, that's a good sign, right? We want to have our youth be in a position where relationships are important to them. And so we want to lean into that, right? They're finding value in connecting with others and they're missing that. And we want to connect with them and validate that. You might have other youth that you're working with that are on the other side of that continuum. So maybe you have a youth who's really experiencing a lot of anxiety about physical distancing. Maybe they are worried about other things, like if they're independent youth and they're worried about paying their rent, and they're worried about utilities, and they're worried about where they're going to get food, right? So we have to really respond to those, real issues, accept those and validate those, not be dismissive, like, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. Let's just go ahead and do our activity here, right? So we can't skate over those things. So we want to be as helpful as possible and validate and accept those are real issues that some of our youth are dealing with, many of our youth are dealing with. Remember, just again, this idea of not being able to do what we want to do is a very helpless feeling. And that also, recreates the feeling that we often feel when we've had a traumatizing experience. Helplessness is synonymous with traumatic experiences often. So not being able to do something that you want to do is really important. The other thing is, unpredictability, right? It's another kind of area where it's connected a lot with traumatizing experiences. And there's a lot of unpredictability right now. What's going to happen? When's it going to happen? We're all looking for information about that, which brings us to giving honest answers, right? So one thing that's really, really important is that we give honest information to our youth and families at this time. I was on a webinar a few weeks ago and heard Dr. Bruce Perry talk about this, and he said, bad but known is better than unpredictable and unknown. And I think that was like perfect for describing why it's so important that we provide honest answers and that we give information. We just not too long ago had an experience of this as a whole society. If you were listening or following Dr. Fauci, and a couple of weeks ago, he talked about, sort of preparing us for the upcoming week, which was to be expected to be, kind of one of the worst weeks of the experience. And so it's going to get bad. He said, it's going to get bad. We need to be prepared. But then he also gave a reassuring message as much as he could, right? Which was to say, this is going to be disturbing, but this is what we have to do for this to turn around, right? So there's a flip side. And so, there's a timing with that I talk about often is, you don't want to, again, skate so quickly over, the difficult information that you're dismissing, what that feels to absorb that. But we do also want to have this hopeful message. We've got to have a little bit of a balance there. And again, so you gotta kind of work on what's your timing there and what's the best way to give honest answers and talk about difficult information, but to also be reassuring and talk about how we are going to come out on the other side of this okay. Briefly speaking, another thing that's really important when we're doing interaction, in our in-person interactions, this can be a little easier because you can sort of read communication in the room. There's sort of an energy between two people who are connecting or who are in an interaction. And so it helps you sort of know a little bit more easily when to be quiet and when it's time to talk. And it's harder to do that when you don't have that in-person interaction. So it's this idea of managing silence, right? So some of us have a struggle with managing silence anyway, even when we're in person, but this can be a little more difficult, even more so when we're on video or when we're on the phone. And so you have to remember, if you're constantly jumping in during the periods of silence, you could be interrupting the other person's thought. Right. So we want to make sure we're managing silence there. The other thing that's kind of awkward and different about some of our our virtual platforms is that when I'm talking, I may cut off the mic of the other person. And so sometimes you get this kind of weird like delay, or this sense of talking over each other can happen. And so, you just want to sort of learn your platform in that way, get kind of a new rhythm when you're interacting with somebody in these virtual platforms, so that we're trying to limit as much as possible this, talking over or cutting other people off. You might think also about just speaking in sort of shorter segments, right? So kind of giving enough of a thought about something, and then stopping for a moment to see if the other person has something they want to add or jump in. I mean, that's probably good advice anyway, but even more so when you, again, can't sort of read the energy of the room, we might want to think about doing that a little differently, or, think about how we manage that. Self-disclosure. We talk about, self-disclosure, and many of you have shared with us during training or when we're in our coaching sessions about how you share experiences that you have had when you feel like that might be a helpful experience for the young person. And so, this idea of sharing experiences is really important. In some ways, we are having a shared experience, all of us, as we're dealing with physical distancing and staying farther physically away from each other. And so it's okay to share, some of your uneasiness, right? It's okay to kind of lean into that and say to your young person, yeah, I'm not sure either what's going to happen on the other side. Here's what I've heard, and here's what I think, and here's the things that I might be worried about, right? And so again, just like any self-disclosure, you want to be really careful about that. Am I sharing this right now because it makes me feel better, or am I sharing this because I think it's going to be helpful for this young person? And then the other thing that I think about when it comes to self-disclosure right now is something that I actually saw floating around on Facebook. And it was this description about how we're definitely in the same storm, right? So we're all experiencing physical distancing, and we're dealing with, this together in terms of stay-at-home orders and that sort of thing. But it's not necessarily, we're all in the same boat, rather. We're not always in the same storm when it comes to this, right? So for some people, being at home feels like a break. It feels relaxing. We're glad to have it. We're not necessarily worried about, in the long term, we're not worried about what's going to happen, those kinds of things. We feel okay. For other people, the storm is a little bit scary. It's a little more disruptive. It's a little more disheartening. Maybe we're watching the news a little more than we had been previously, those kinds of things. And so it's rockier, this storm. And then for others of us, this is like completely blowing the windows out. This is like a hurricane we've never felt before. It's terrifying. It's pulling off the roof. It's right. So you got to kind of know where you are in this, and where is the young person that you're working with, right? How are they experiencing this? And so thinking about that, not only how are they experiencing this, but if they're living with caregivers, how are their caregivers experiencing the storm, right? Because that's obviously going to affect and impact, kind of their notions about the level of danger and their level and sense of safety. So all things to think about, right? When we're sharing, we need to be sensitive about what the other person's experience in this, in their storm looks like. The other thing that we talk about in terms of the 7 skills, right? Recognizing and accepting behaviors that reflect grief responses. And so when we're sort of under higher levels of stress, we definitely get more fearful, and we definitely get more reactionary. And, I have to tell you that about a month ago, when things were really starting to amp up, I had my own experience of this in terms of a really strong reaction, a fight or flight response for sure, where I felt like I got to go to the grocery store. I got to get all kinds of stuff. I need to stock up. And I was definitely a part of the panic buying. There was just something that sort of took over. I can't, it's kind of hard to explain, right? And it just sort of took over, and it drove me and compelled me to really get a lot of things to get ready for whatever was coming, for this threat, right? So looking back, that doesn't seem really smart. I don't know that I would have to do that again or feel like that was necessary, but in that moment, that was the response that I had. So, this is really important for us to clue ourselves into, right? We talk about this a lot. We talk about the fight or flight response. We talk about it like we know, what that is, but now some of us are actually experiencing that on a different level. And it's like, oh, okay, I kind of get this idea now about how things get a little bit out of your control. You're not using the thinking parts of your brain. So we definitely want to be thinking about that and understand the behaviors that we see in ourselves in our friends and our family, in those that we're working with. These are definitely reflecting grief responses. They're reflecting responses to the traumatic experience that we're all having. And so we want to really clue into that, right? So remember that when we are under these extreme amounts of stress, the thinking part of our brain goes more and more offline, and we're not doing things from a logical place. We're doing things from an emotional place. So really important to think about that. So we want to explore those feelings, right? Something else that you're seeing if you're on social media is a little saying that's going around. That feeling that you're feeling, that's grief, right? The loss of the ability to do what we want, the loss of the ability, to live our identity, right? I mean, these are losses, right? Many of us are working in different ways, and so that's hard. You might not feel like, I'm not really a social worker. I'm not seeing people. That's not what social workers do. We go out in the field, we see people, we spend time, and I'm not doing that. So, my identity sort of is like, am I who I am if I can't do these things? So we got to explore that, understand that for the youth and the families that we're working with. Recognize that everybody right now may be having some difficulty or struggling to kind of understand what the future is going to look like. It's another thing that you're hearing a lot of people say is that we'll never go back to what it was, right? We don't know what it's going to be, but it's not going to be what it was. And so we're all sort of struggling to kind of understand what future looks like. And so it might be even more so difficult for the youth that we're working with to do that. A lot of the work that we tend to do, that we were doing prior to this experience, was trying to think about how we get our youth to focus on future. How do we get them through that process where they can really do the reflection and understand their past experiences so that they can look forward. And we're all sort of struggling with that right now. It's like right now, time is sort of stopping, right? I have so many questions that people are asking. I was like, I don't know, we'll have to wait and see, right? And so it's going to be a little bit more difficult, I think, for us to really spend a lot of time focusing so much on the future like we've been trying to do in the past. And I think that's okay, right? So right now, the important thing is that we focus on here and now, and that we're paying attention to meeting needs that are current needs, and just taking care of each other right now when things are really in that period of unpredictability, and a lot of the unknown is still happening and very real. Responding to those losses, right? Really, really important. And again, borrowing from some of the folks that I've recently participated in webinars with, Dr. Bruce Perry, Bessel van der Kolk. These are things, presentations that I've seen recently that reiterate and help us be reminded of how we need to respond to losses, and loss of predictability. Create schedules, right? Do things that are predictable. You don't have to be rigid about these schedules, but ask your youth, how are you setting up your day? Are you getting into a routine? Talk to them about the importance of routines and how routines really can help them feel better. It might not seem like that on the surface, but you know what? When you get into a routine, that pattern and that repetition is just going to help you feel a little bit more regulated and just feel better. The idea of immobility, like a lot of us are not getting outside, we're not getting the physical activity that we need. This is really important, that we're not sitting in one spot all day long, right? That we're getting up regularly, that we're getting up frequently, moving around, getting as much motion in our bodies as we possibly can. So take a walk, get up and, do it. Even if the walk is, right, I'm going to walk from the kitchen to the hallway, to the bathroom, to the living room, like do that little circle and get up and move around. Got to stay connected, right? So we want to encourage our young people. We're going to stay connected with them, and we want to encourage them to stay connected to the people that are important to them as well. So we're going to be asking them to reach out to people. Have you talked with your cousin? You guys were really spending a lot of time together. Have you reached out, right? So just encouraging them to do that, and reminding them about the importance of staying connected if they're not already doing that. We definitely are experiencing a loss of sort of time, and the sequence of time is getting kind of, sometimes jumbled. It feels like one day is a week. Something that happened yesterday feels like 10 years ago. And so, again, predictability will help with that. Routines will help with that. Just sort of getting ourselves reconnected to time and sequence. Again, I talked a minute ago about this idea of loss of a sense of purpose, right? So this can be really easy to fall into, not being connected to the things that we like doing. The things that we like doing are part of our identity. So when we're not able to do those things, it's a loss of opportunity to be who we are. And so we want to acknowledge that, right? We might not be able to do so much to completely fix that right now, but we do want to acknowledge that that's a real experience, that's a real issue that we might be experiencing. Virtual activity ideas. So I want to just give you a few ideas about some of the things that you can do using these virtual platforms. You might do something like suggest some sort of media assignment, like, here's a movie that I want you to watch. Go watch this movie. I'm going to watch this movie. Look for these couple of themes while you're doing it. And then when you get back together, you can talk about those themes, right? Or ask your youth to share with you what are some of their favorite movies. Talk about playlists. I was talking with another group not too long ago. We were having a nice chuckle about our pandemic playlist, right? And so what are some of the songs that speak to you about this time? Giving them assignments around media, listen to the music that they choose, use maybe suggest music that they might listen to, right? So something as simple as a media assignment. Teaching a relaxation exercise, right? There's tons of apps out there. You can use breathing exercises. You can use different forms of meditation. So there's lots of things available out there to help us learn how to relax. So work with your young person on that. Talk with them about what are the things that make you feel more calm, that make you feel more regulated, and practice those things with your young person. You might use guided imagery. You might suggest different apps that can be downloaded on their phone. I've also heard this recently too, right? And I think this is true, right? There's something regulated about video games. I've heard Dr. Bruce Perry talk about that. And so I don't feel so bad about the amount of video games my kids are playing right now. Maybe it just makes me feel better, right? But the idea that you're doing something that's relaxing and that feels good and reassuring and regulating for you is important. You might think about doing a worry jar or some sort of adaptation of this where, you can talk with your youth about writing down the things that they're worried about. So, between now and the next time that I see you, if a worry comes to mind, just write that down and put it in your jar. And then when we talk with you next time, when we get together, we can pull some of the things out of the jar and you can talk with me about that. So sometimes it can be helpful just, I can't do anything about this worry right now, or I don't really want to go there, but I don't want to lose it, right? I want to sort of give it some level of importance. And so we write that on the slip of paper, we put that in the jar, and there's a time for us to work on that together. Think about gratitude journals, right? There's a lot of research out there that talks about how doing a gratitude journal or getting connected with thankfulness, right, is really important and can be really healing. And so activate the right parts of the brain, right? So, do a gratitude journal. Every night you're just going to write down 3 things that you're thankful for that happened today. It could be simplest little things like, I was thankful that when I went to the refrigerator, we still had some leftover pasta from last night because that was really good. And so I'm thankful that there was a little bit of that for me to have, or I'm thankful that I got the last cookie. Something that it could be very simple, could be something else, but getting into the routine of doing a gratitude journal, doing something that has us connected with the things that are going well and that we're thankful for can be really important right now. Another idea, maybe a scavenger hunt. I've heard a lot of people talking about doing scavenger hunts. And so looking for things that kids might have or families might have readily available. Go find a bouncy ball, go find a rubber band, find me a Band-Aid. Do you have an eraser? Do you have a mirror? What about Play-Doh, right? And so whatever they find, right, you can use that. So if they come back with a rubber band, you can talk about resiliency. If they come back with a Band-Aid, you can talk about, what it's like to heal things that hurt us. If they come back with an eraser, you can talk about mistakes and how we manage our mistakes and how we repair our mistakes. Play-Doh maybe is molding our future. So, come up with a list of these items that you can connect to things that, you've been working on or talking with your young person about. This was an idea too that I picked up somewhere, and it's the idea of fortunately and unfortunately stories. And there was a book by author and illustrator Remy Charlip. This book has been around for a long, long time, and this book is called Fortunately, and you can actually find this book on YouTube. There are lots of videos of people reading the story, so if you want to do that, you can find a video of somebody reading the story. And basically, it's just a series of statements. Like the book actually starts out, fortunately, Ned was invited to a surprise party. Unfortunately, the party was 1,000 miles away. Fortunately, a friend loaned Ned an airplane. Unfortunately, the motor exploded. So you could actually sort of play this game with your youth with the family, and kind of talk about unfortunately, right? And it can be really revealing. You can do some creative and fun things with that. It's sort of a playful way to just connect with them around the things that maybe they're worried about and the things that they feel hopeful and grateful for. So it's kind of a mix of that worry jar and the gratitude journal. Good old-fashioned pen and paper, like I mentioned. Remember that not all activities have to be sophisticated and complicated and have all these moving parts. So sometimes it's just a plain old pen and paper, pros and cons list. We have an activity in our workbook that we often recommend called Divide Your Life in Thirds. And so you might do something simple like that. If you're writing, if you're going to have something behind you and you're writing, you want to use a dark marker so they can see what you're writing. You want to make sure that you have your camera situated so that it doesn't show up backwards on the screen. So there's a way to turn that around. But again, good old-fashioned pen and paper is something that can be really helpful. I mentioned movement a minute ago. You actually might join in and do some movement with the youth that you're working with. Maybe you play Simon Says, maybe you try out yoga together. Do something that incorporates movement so that you can practice that. Get creative. Lots of people getting creative with movement using virtual platforms. So it's important that you talk with your young person about how they need to get up and get moving throughout the day. So those are just a few ideas of sort of activities that you might do with your young people, ways that you might connect with them in terms of thinking about activities. So let's just talk quickly about technical issues. Again, not a technology expert necessarily, but some things to think about. You want to get comfortable with the technology that you're using. I think by now, a lot of us are kind of well on the way to doing that we've been practicing. We've been using a lot of these technologies now. One of the things that I mentioned just quickly a second ago about the writing behind you in the background, there's a mirroring function on a lot of our devices that we want to make sure that we're paying attention to. And that's the button that you sort of toggle on and off to make sure that what you're writing appears correctly to the person that's on the other side of the screen. So look for that on whatever platform that you're using. Make sure you have good lighting so that the person who you're interacting with can see you clearly. That's really important. And then think about the limits of your client's technology. Maybe they're on a data plan that has limits. Maybe they have limits on the minutes on their cell phone, whatever that might be. They might not have really good connectivity. And so these are things that you want to be thinking about as well, in terms of not just your ability to connect and your comfort with technology, but what's the comfort level of your kids and families. You can do a couple of things to optimize your connectivity. So you might be hearing about platforms like Netflix and others who are kind of scaling back on the high definition video that they're putting out to increase connectivity. And so think about that often on your app or on your different platform. You can change the level of resolution on your video so that you can increase connectivity. If you have a lot of apps or other things running in the background, try to shut all those down because they just take bandwidth. They just take extra, oomph to work. And so you want to turn all that stuff off. Make sure that you are paying attention to your audio settings, your microphone, testing those things out to make sure they work. Often if you can connect your device through Ethernet to your modem or router, you can get better connectivity that way rather than just using the simple Wi-Fi. And so those things are important. And then make a contingency plan with your youth, right? So you say to them, hey, if we get disconnected, I'll just call you. Or if something really goes wrong and the phone stops working and I can't get in touch with you, I'll try you in a couple of hours or whatever that is. But make some sort of plan so that as much as possible, you don't have this kind of abrupt ending, which can happen. All right, so those were some of the ideas that I wanted to share with you in terms of how we can connect in these virtual ways. Before we leave you, I have one more thing that I want to talk about, and that's just the idea of self-care. Really, really important that we think about our own self-care. If we are feeling really dysregulated, we cannot regulate and comfort another person. Really difficult to do that. So I know I talk about this a lot, and sometimes it feels kind of like Pollyanna, like, oh, okay, yes, take care of yourself. We know. But this, guys, is really, really important right now that you are honing in on what you need as well, and that you're taking the time to hone in on that. I have definitely reduced the amount of time that I am spending watching the news because that wasn't helpful. That was not helping me feel more comfortable. Yes, I was getting a lot of information, but I was getting overloaded, right? So really important to think about those things. Use some of this time to continue your own learning, right? I mean, we have less things to do in many ways. For a lot of us, again, we're not traveling as much. We're finding different kinds of time that we didn't have before. And so use that. A lot of people are offering free webinars right now, such as this one. Other professionals that you might be interested in hearing more about their work, they're offering opportunities to connect. So do that if that's part of your self-care. Take the time, to really make sure that you're paying attention to what your needs are. So just, final thoughts, what we thought maybe was impossible when we first started, to say, like, we're never going to be able to do our work. How are we ever going to connect with young people? How are we going to continue doing what we're doing if we can't do home visits, if we can't connect in person? It's not impossible. It is very possible. And I hope that you've got a couple of things that you were able to pick up from today. I know that you came into this with ideas and things that you were already doing. So keep that up. And, again, I'll sort of steal something that I saw on Facebook, and that is that right now we're teaching lots of lessons. We're teaching lessons about flexibility to our young people. We're teaching them that we're going to show up, right? Even when it's hard to do that, we're going to show up. We're hopefully teaching them that communities are doing things, together and for the good of everyone, right? Hopefully we're having those experiences, and that when the world gets scary, there are good people that we can find, and there are helpers, right? And that we cared enough to be there is really important. So, regardless of what you hope to achieve with your youth in terms of kind of your typical or normal work with them, this is an important time too. Don't ever feel like we're not getting to the work. Just spending the time in relationship with our young people is a really, really important part of this puzzle. So don't underestimate that. Reach out to us if you want to connect. You can visit us on our website. You can find us on Facebook. Please find ways to stay connected with us and reach out if there's something that we can do to help further your work. So I hope this has been helpful for you all. If you do have questions, please feel free again to follow up, and take good care of yourselves, and look forward to talking with many of you soon. Bye.